Friends, welcome to another Pints with Jack Skype Sessions, where I am joined by my friend David Bates. David, welcome.
Hello.
Hello. And we join together and we have a more colloquial conversation about a specific topic each week. And it's usually inspired by something we talk about on the podcast. So if you're not a podcast subscriber, go listen to that now. But this week, we're going to be talking about something I believe a lot of us can relate with, and that's this concept of preventing joy. We're almost too afraid to be vulnerable to joy. And so the question I want us to look at today that was spurred by this week's episode is, why do we not allow ourselves to experience joy, or maybe some of us do it better than others, but to experience the fullness of joy? What is it that gets in the way of that, and what can we learn from that? So, David, thank you for joining me today and providing your wisdom. Usually we drink scotch or something, but this is a late weeknight recording and we both have work the next day. So I'm drinking LaCroix.
I'm drinking Kirkland, which is like posh LaCroix.
Oh, love it. All right. Well, cheers, my friend.
Cheers.
To set this up, some context. Until we have faces, there is a scene when Orwell is going to visit her sister who has been sacrificed, to find her sister, actually to bury her, or at least she thinks she's going to be doing that. And as she's heading up to this mountain, called the Mountain of the Gods, and she starts to experience this desire, this longing within her. And it stirs something, but then she's fighting it. And so I want to read a little bit here to get us some of her words. She felt this voice speak to her, but she says without words, "Why should your heart not dance?" It was inviting her heart to dance, to feel that joy. And she thought, my heart to dance? Mine whose love was taken from me? I, the ugly princess who must never look for other love? The drudge of the king, the jailer of hateful Redival, that's her sister, perhaps to be murdered or turned out as a beggar when my father die, for who knew what Glome would do then? And she says, reason called for it. I knew the world too well to believe this sudden smiling. I was not a fool. There is a lot there that I want us to unpack on this episode. A lot of wisdom, psychologically speaking, that we can all relate to in our own journeys and our own personal journeys, life journeys, and spiritual journeys. So before opening this up, I'd love to get your thoughts on what you thought of when you heard that.
It put me in mind of various funerals that I've gone to and the experiences of death of close friends and family in my own life. And Orwell touches on some of the reasons why people tend not to be happy at funerals. When you're at a funeral, it seems unseemly to appear too happy. And there's an insidious lie that I think we technically know it's not true, but it doesn't feel like that at the time. It feels like if we experience any happiness when our close friend, our close family member, when they're not there anymore, if we can experience joy with them, not with us, then that shows that we never really loved them. And I think that's the main thing that is driving Orwell in this scene. But also, she's a bit of a cynic because she thinks that the gods are just out to get her. And therefore, if she allows herself to feel joy, then that she's like a balloon that's blowing up and it's just begging to be popped. So she doesn't want to experience joy because then that will give the gods pleasure in bringing her down a peg or two.
You almost get the picture that she's worried the other shoe is about to drop.
Absolutely.
Because she describes all this pain that she's experienced in life. And are you familiar with Brene Brown?
Mm-hmm. You've actually mentioned her a few times on the show.
I love Brene Brown. She's have you ever seen her TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So she is, for listeners, she is probably the preeminent psychologist on vulnerability and the role that plays in our lives. And so I read her book, Daring Greatly. Incredible book about well, daring greatly, living boldly, being vulnerable, putting yourself out there, and how we handle shame. But she actually calls it almost describes perfectly what Orwell's going through. And she calls it dress rehearsing tragedy, is actually the term she has for it. And she says, joy is the most vulnerable emotion we experience. And if you cannot tolerate joy, what you do is you start dress rehearsing tragedy. The idea that she describes that you play out these future scenes of how it's going to go wrong, even before it does, because you've experienced enough in life that proves to you that the joy will go away at some point. And so you use the word cynic. And she describes it as, imagine you're the mother looking over your child and you see it sleeping and you say, oh, so beautiful. I love you. But then you quickly picture something horrific happening to your child out of fear. So that moment of joy, pure bliss and joy, goes away. And that's actually a defense mechanism, which is just what Orwell did there. And so I'm curious, actually, if you've ever experienced that in your own life, where you've essentially suppressed joy because you're afraid. Not to put you on the spot, David.
Well, what I was going to say is there is some truth to this. I would say it's almost healthy. But as we often talk about with St. Augustine, things that are evil are usually things that are good, that are twisted. Evil isn't a thing in itself. So I remember at one point in my life, my mother noticed the past few books that she had seen me reading. One was Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? Where is God When It Hurts? There were several titles like this. And she asked me about it. And I said, well, everything's just going so great at the moment. I know it can't last. Which sounds horrendously cynical, but I didn't actually think so. Because I think there's a difference between being prepared and living in that disastrous future. There's one, letting all of your nightmares become reality and experience them now. Lewis actually talks about this in the Screwtape Letters. So this is a senior demon writing to a junior demon about a Christian that he's tempting. And he says, let this Christian, let him be really worried about the future and let him see in his mind a series of contradictory calamities. They can't all happen, but let him see all of them and just be overwhelmed by it and rob him of his joy in that way. So I think there is a subtle difference between allowing that to happen to yourself and holding things of this world loosely, to being able to appreciate them for what they are and the goodness that is in them, and appreciating the giver who gave you this gift, versus hanging on to it in such a way that your life will fall apart when it goes away too.
That last part there, appreciating it for what it is. You just indirectly, with probably out knowing it, answered what Brene Brown would argue is the response, how we overcome this. So she says, scarcity and fear drive foreboding joy.
That's easy for you to say.
We're afraid that the feeling of joy won't last, or that there won't be enough, or that the transition to disappointment will be too difficult. We've learned that giving in to joy is at best setting ourselves up for disappointment and at worst inviting disaster. And we struggle with the worthiness issue. Do we deserve our joy given our inadequacies and imperfections? So if the opposite of scarcity is enough, then practicing gratitude is how we acknowledge that there's enough and that we're enough. So I look at that as, in this moment, recognize what it's for. Be grateful for that moment with your child if you're looking over it, or be grateful for the longing that's coming to you in that moment, in that it's enough in that moment, but it's not everything. And I think that's somewhat what you're saying there a little bit at the end. Appreciate it for what it is, but don't appreciate it for what it's not. And what it's not is some solution to all of your problems. What it's not is some perfect panacea that's going to make you just full of joy for the rest of your life. It's just in this moment, thank you for it. And then when the next moment comes, even if it's a lot less than that, or if it's actually more on the suffering side, you can still come and approach it with gratitude and find the things within it to be grateful for. Because I like how she said gratitude counters the scarcity, because scarcity is that there's not enough, and gratitude says there is enough.
And Lewis says something sort of similar in Mere Christianity, where he talks about people trying to recapture the original thrill behind something that gave them real joy, whether it was a marriage, a hobby, whatever it was, to always be trying to get how I immediately felt the very first time. And he says that if you actually hold that a little bit more loosely, it opens you up to experience joy in new ways. And in his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he even says that when I try and grab the joy, it always disappears in my fingers. It was only when I'm more open to encountering it in new ways that I tend to find it.
You know, this also makes me think of, if you read my blog post,
I did.
Good. The Henry Nouwen. It makes me think of, so I believe her response goes to part of it, which is the gratitude side. That's actually very G.K. Chesterton. He argues the two main things you should do with life is approach it with wonder and gratitude. But I believe, so that answers the question of like, this moment is enough. But another part of a fear of vulnerability is questioning if we're enough. And I love that Henry Nouwen is so big on we are beloved. And we've talked about this before on the podcast. I wrote about it, how when we can sit in that silence, that solitude, and that stillness and hear the voice of God that says you are loved and you are beloved, when you combine that with a disposition of gratitude and you approach life, like you really spend, whether it's 5 minutes every day in gratitude and then 5 minutes reflecting on the love of God in your life, you can actually handle the joy a lot better. You can first be appreciative for it. You can feel you're worthy of it. And then you can also trust that when you go into other situations where you don't have that it'll be okay as well.
It almost reminds me of the way teenagers are sometimes, when they never want to reveal to other teenagers that there's something that they really love.
Yes.
Particularly if it's something not that cool. Like, oh, I really love 70s music. It's like,
I thought that actually. The way they hold back.
But part of it comes from, at that age, you're still trying to find yourself, and you're very often not on a very sure footing, because you are questioning all things about your own value and your place in the world.
Yes.
It's typically only when people get a little older and a little bit more established and they know who they are and they know that their interests are their interests and it doesn't matter a fig what anyone else thinks.
Yes.
That they can stand confidently in those and experience the joy of whatever weird hobby they want to do.
This is challenging me now as we listen to all this, because I mean, you essentially said, as you get more assured of yourself, you're more comfortable in those situations, and you're more comfortable in your decisions, in your interests.
It's like you and Taylor Swift. I think you should be thoroughly ashamed of yourself, but
Nope.
You are confident in yourself and you own it.
I always tell people, is that a guilty pleasure? No, it is a pleasure. No guilt. No guilt. But yes, I do believe, like in my own life, when I have spent more time in gratitude and more time in that silence, I've overcome a lot of these things, and I believe I've been able to experience joy. But what you realize, it's a habit. In my own life, at least, I've realized that. And I am not doing the gratitude one well lately. Honestly, by lately, I mean the last 12 months of my life. And I do the Henry Nouwen silence, being loved by God, a lot better. But these are just tips for people's spiritual lives that can really be helpful. And in my own experience, they are as well. Anything else you'd like to add?
I just want to warn the people, if you find yourself starting to like Taylor Swift as a result of this, maybe lay back on it a bit.
You got to ease into it. If you start feeling shame about it, just call me. I'm here for you. Just shake it off.
Yeah.
On that note.
And with that, cheers.
Cheers, David.